Greetings, welcome to another session of Tuesday Talks. This series is all about second language acquisition theories, and today we're going to be looking at some cognitive approaches to second language learning. These are theories. They're kind of difficult to wrap your head around because there's a lot of metacognitive ideas going on here with exactly how the brain processes information. There are going to be two basic areas, two basic fields, two opposing views of how language is learned, and we're going to look at both of them. One is the processing approaches, and there are about two or three of those, and then one is Connectionism, which is a little bit of a newer type of theory that's on the market today. Let's jump right into a small introduction here, looking at some of the linguistic dimensions in this research. You have, first of all, you have what I would call the innatists, the Chomskyites, those who believe that there's this innate ability within within the brain, within the mind, to process and develop and use linguistic information, language. And there are a variety of dimensions involved in that. There are some of these transition theories where you're beginning information and you process it in the brain, and you process it in a temporary location, and then you move it on to a more permanent location once they're understood and able to be used. Many language processes are in the brain, not just language. There are many learning processes that are going on in the brain. And so we want to find out what these processes are so that we can better understand how second language acquisition works. Okay, and as I said, you've got the innatists over here, and that's the first group that we're going to be looking at. And they're the ones that say there are rules, there are segments in the brain that are specifically written out for language learning. And then you've got the cognitivists, and they're not so much so. They're saying that basically both language learning processes and other learning processes are basically the same. And so we have this dichotomy of researchers who are looking at this whole process called language learning, second language acquisition, or language acquisition. The types of cognitive theorists here, as I've mentioned, you've got the processing group, you've got the processing researchers, and there's a difference between competence and performance, and I believe we've talked about this before. Competence, in other words, I know what this is, I know what the procedure is, but I can't actually do it. Okay, knowing what it is, knowing how to do it is one thing. Actually doing it is the performance end. So we have this competence performance thing, and they're separate. And then, of course, the goal is how to take what I know and put it into action. How do I take something that's potential and make it actual type of idea? And there's a difference there that some theorists hold that there's a difference. And then there's those who are the emergent theorists. And they will say that competency and performance are actually the same thing, or in the same place. And their idea is, with repeated use of this linguistic information, that the ability to use it, the ability to understand it, just will emerge out of it. And so they're more of an emergent type of thing. There's no distinction between performance and competence. Okay, generally they do the same, they learn the same, they acquire that same understanding the same way any other learning process is done within the brain. You see the difference between the two. The processing guys, two separate entities as far as an innate ability, and there's two separate sides, performance and competence, and then they're the emergent ones who are saying everything's all together. And you just learn language simply the way you would learn something else, just through practice. Let's take a look at the processing group here, first of all. And they, of course, their interest here is how do second language learners process information? That's what they want to know. They want to find out how they process linguistic information, and they're focusing their research on computational parts of language learning. What that means is that they're focusing on the parts of the language learning process that we can actually measure. Okay, these are more of your hardcore science people that want to actually have numbers associated with it, so they can find some type of a test to measure. The emergent research groups, and by the way, just to pause, both of these guys, both of these groups are doing real research. They're trying to find out what's going on. There's really no way right now that we can say one group is right and one group is wrong. Obviously you're going to have an opinion, but it's good to look and see what both of these groups are doing and see the research that's behind them. All right, the emergent group, they believe that if you use it, it'll emerge. Okay, so their idea is that language is driven by communication. The more you practice, the more you're involved in the process, the more you're going to be able to use the language. There is no innate ability, like the processing people will believe. Instead, there is a mapping of words and sounds to conceptual meanings. And as you develop normal patterns, right, as you continue to use that phrase with that meaning over and over again, or that stock phrase over and over again, and then the meaning is going to be applied to it, and they're going to be able to use that. Okay, and so they develop a regular pattern. It looks like it's rules, but it's really not. Okay, it's an associative learning process. Okay, Connectionism. Okay, so I have a path from this idea to this sound, right? Or I have a path from this idea to this word. And through use and using it again and again, that idea gets stronger and stronger. Similar to the way neural networks develop in the brain, or computer networks develop. At least that's the theory. Okay, this associative learning process is where you find things like Connectionism and constructivism. And constructivism in the world of education, and language education in particular, is all over the place right now, that we're constructing our own understanding. Okay, and that's in this area of emergent language acquisition. Those processes that are going on there are the emergent style, not the processing one where you have the innate ability and you have the separate ideas of separate place in the brain, and that competence and performance are separate entities. Okay, we got this? I think it's a little confusing. Now we're going to go in and look at some of more detail in these areas. Now the processing approaches, let's go back to them. They are information processing, and that's the model that we're going to be looking at. Their beliefs are that, first of all, that man is autonomous. Okay, in other words, he's just running. The brain is running, and if there's stimulus around, it's just going to automatically process without me having to do anything. It's active. Okay, you have active listening, you have active thinking. It's just running, it's just working. You look at a picture and instantly your brain is trying to identify patterns, just the way it is, right? Okay, the mind is a symbol processing machine. Again, no matter what you look at, you're trying to identify what are the symbols within this. Whether it's letters, whether it's shapes, whether it's colors, you're trying to identify. If we could bring in pictures here and just have you, hey, look at this picture, your brain starts to try to identify what those things are. And that's the idea here. Now, this process is very complex. There are a whole bunch of different things going on in your brain when you look at something or when you hear something, and the processes that's going on there. However, those complex processes can be broken down into simpler processes. Now, a simple process we can study, and that's their goal in the processing approaches. In the information processing model, they want to look at the simple processes, find a way to measure them so that they can then build up to the more complex one. Last thing that they believe is that the mind is a limited capacity processor. What they mean by this is your brain can only take so much information that it has to process before it says, no more. Okay? Just think of a little kid, and you can give it so much, you can give this kid so much information, but then they eventually say, stop, I can't handle anymore. If you're a teacher and you're in a classroom and you have a 1-hour lecture, you should notice your students, because at some point your students start turning off their mind because they've too much information. They've overloaded, so they can't process anymore. So you need to take a break. You let them process some of that information. It's a limited capacity. There's only so much, if I could use computer terminology, there's only so much RAM in the brain that can be used for processing. At some point you need to stop adding more information and let the brain process that before, because it has a limited capacity. This also means that the ability to learn is limited by that processing capabilities. Okay, which means you can't learn a bajillion things quickly. Okay, the brain just can't handle that, at least in the normal download fashion that we learn. And we download by seeing and hearing primarily, as far as learning information. We may learn by touching or smelling also, but primarily by listening and speaking. Limited capacity processor. All right, so how do we learn? How do we understand this? First of all, you need to realize that learning is a cognitive process. It's the stuff that's going on inside the brain, and you could say even inside the mind, where you're trying to understand something. Generally speaking, you work from controlled responses, okay, of new information. So you get a burst of new information, and you try to control that information. And after you gain control over it, you begin to take it and push it into more permanent memory locations, long-term memory. Okay? Again, think of yourself when you began to drive or when you began to ride a bike. Okay? You began to ride a bike, I mean, your hands are all over the place, and you're wiggling and wobbling, and right, because you don't know all the processes that are involved here. After you learn the process, you do it without thinking, because you've taken that temporary information, that short-term memory information, and you've thrown it back into longer-term memory. Driving a car, same type of thing. I mean, you're constantly looking and touching and trying to figure out where to put your hands and where's the turn signal, lever, and but eventually you learn this stuff, and I'm guaranteed if you're a seasoned driver, you've had the experience of driving somewhere, and when you get to your destination, you look up and you say, "How did I get here?" Because you've taken what you've learned and you've put it into long-term memory. Okay, so you've gone through that first process and went to the second process. Okay, learning is similar. You move controlled processes to the automatic section in the back, okay, which results in linguistic restructuring. So you take a new phrase, you take a new word in this second language, and at first you have to consciously think about it. But after you learn it, okay, you can stick it back into your automatic processes, and you don't even have to think about it anymore. You can just use that part of the language. Now, of course, our goal as language teachers is to find ways to get our students to take the short-term memory things, stick them into long-term. Another type of model, which is similar, which is Anderson's ACT model. He has broken this down not into 2 steps, but into 3. You've got the working memory, which the processing model would traditionally call short-term memory. And then you have 2 kinds of long-term memory. You've got declarative knowledge. That's information that you say, hey, I know what this is. How to do it, how to activate it, how to actually go through the process, I don't know. That's procedural knowledge. So you've got declarative knowledge, I know this. And you have procedural knowledge, I know how to do this. You see the difference between the 2, right? Okay, let's hope so. Related to this, you have some cognitive stages. Okay, having the knowledge is that first cognitive stage. And then you have the associative stage, okay? And that's having the skill to use that knowledge. Okay, so we go back, it's similar to the declarative and the procedural. And then we have the autonomous stage where we do it without thinking. And we can walk through these processes. We can learn the declarative, we can learn the cognitive stage where we have that knowledge. Okay, I have the knowledge, don't know how to use it yet. Then we go to the next step, which is the associative. Okay, so now I'm applying what I know to some association of how to use it properly. And then it becomes autonomous. The best example that I had is the word to carry the load, which for me was a Japanese word. And I studied that in a book. Okay, and it meant to carry a load. It was actually, to put it on your shoulder type of thing. And I knew the word, and so that's my cognitive stage. I had that word. I didn't know how to use it. I didn't know how to put it into a sentence. And one day I'm in a faculty meeting, and all of a sudden, one of the people in the faculty meeting, they used that word in a sentence. And it was like, bing! And I zoomed in on that. I said, oh man, that's that word. I know that word, and now I know how to use it. There I was at the associative stage. And now, I don't think about it when I go to use the word in Japanese. Okay? But I went through those 3 stages. And to be honest, the step between the cognitive and the associative, or the step between the declarative and the procedural, for me, was a while. I bet you it was a year since I learned the word, and then since I could actually understand how I could use it. It was about a year before I actually heard somebody use that word. Anyway, you go through those processes, right? That's this whole idea with Anderson's model. Okay? All right. There's also the processability theory. Explains that explains language processing and represents linguistic information. Okay, that's the nice thing about this theory, because it explains the process of it, and it also explains the information that you have. That's one of the benefits of this process approach, is that these theories allow for both of these things to be explained at the same time. Second language acquisition, therefore, is the gradual acquisition of language processing. In other words, second language acquisition is me stepping from this short-term memory and gradually putting in things into longer-term memory. And I'm gradually controlling the elements of the language, taking them out of short-term memory, putting them into long-term, or putting them into declarative and then procedural, and making things autonomous. Learners can control local elements first, so they control the smaller things first, and then they move to the global later. And that's this whole process. That's the theory behind this process model and the ACT model. Okay. Some other related concepts here. One is the perceptual saliency theory, that things that are more memorable, parts of a sentence that are more quickly assimilated into understanding, they're going to be controlled faster. They're going to be learned faster. Typically, these are subject and verbs. The little things that go around them, that have less meaning, that are less memorable, are going to be learned more slowly. Okay, kind of obvious, I would think, but that's one thing that they were talking about, right? Things that are more quickly going to say, oh yeah, I know what this means, because it's a big thing. It's a noun, it's a verb. Next would probably be an adjective. It's a color, right, type of thing. They're going to be learned faster. Okay, the things that are more structural in nature, right? Your noun marker, your preposition, or articles, those types of things, they're going to take longer to learn, and they're going to be harder to control, right? Next idea here is the teachability hypothesis, and you've heard this before in other areas, but this is brought out again through these processes and through these researchers. The stages of learning cannot be skipped. Okay. Again, Pianeman and others are saying this, and you've seen this in other places as well. The stages of learning cannot be skipped. The brain is going to learn it the way the brain is going to learn it, and you can't skip over a certain segment. Okay, you can't learn to fly before you learn to walk. It's the same type of idea. I can't get to the other side of the room until I walk through the middle part of the room. There's no way to get over there. No teleporting with language learners. Okay, although I look forward to the day if that's actually possible. Look forward to the day when you can just, like in the Matrix, where you want to learn how to fly a helicopter, and you can just download all that stuff. Currently, not possible. So, the stages of learning cannot be skipped. And the best instruction should focus on the next stage that the brain needs to learn. Okay? So, if you're going to be teaching language, you find out where they are and give them a little more. Give them a little step beyond what they have, so that they can move on to that next level. And of course, as I'm reading this, I think to myself, hello, isn't this I+1? Same type of thing, right, as Krashen's input hypothesis. This is I+1, so this is not new when Krashen brings it about. It has been talked about before. Some other associated ideas and operating principles related to the processing model. And these are all related to the interlanguage, and how the interlanguage is modifying things as they go along, and what types of modeling, what types of processes are involved here. There's the one-to-one principle. The first learned form, okay, that one uses to express something is generally the one that's used, even though there are other forms of doing something. So, for example, someone learns the word red. Well, they may not use the word rosé or other words for red that aren't coming to mind right now, because they're going to stick with red. They're not going to use crimson, right? They're going to stick with that red. You can see the same thing with a linguistic, with a syntactic form. They'll learn a certain form first, and even though there are other ways to express that thing, they're going to stick with the first one. Typically, okay, the first one that they're going to learn, they're going to stick with. Often the case, okay. The multifunctionality principle. There are times where you have a single form that has there is a single meaning and it has many forms. There are many ways to say the same thing. There are many ways to say negative, for example. There are many ways to say I'm tired. Okay, just for example, many ways that you could say that I'm tired. But there are many forms for saying that, but it's still one meaning. And oftentimes the brain, while it's doing the interlanguage, is trying to identify what these other forms are to say that same thing. Okay, so it's possible that that's happening. Generally speaking, it's going to stick with the first one, but it's also going to be looking for other forms of doing this. When I was learning vocabulary, initially when I'm learning vocabulary in a second language, I go from English, I go from English to that second language. Okay, so for example, carry the load. I went directly from carry the load into the Japanese word for carry the load. But eventually I started defining Japanese words based on other Japanese words. Okay, and that would be better for me to do. That way I would be able to learn synonyms and other ways of saying something similar. Okay, next one. Formal determinism. Clearly encoded ideas are going to be learned faster. Things that have clear definitions are going to be learned faster. Things that have clear encoding in it. ED, for example, is going to have some clear encoding in it. It's going to be learned faster than something that has less clear encoding in it. Kind of makes sense, right? Distributional bias. Let's just say that in a particular language there are I think the example that Mitchell and Miles referred to is that action words oftentimes are in the past more often than stative verbs. Okay, so walk is oftentimes more walked, played are oftentimes used in the past much more than stative verbs, like I am hungry, am. Seems, right? He seems tired. Even though they can be in the past, oftentimes they're not. Usually they're not, but they can be. The rule is that they can be. But because of distributional bias, the brain, when it's trying to build the interlanguage, says, oh, these can be in the past and these can't. Okay, and they'll follow that pattern even though that's really not the pattern. Okay, again, distributional bias. Relevance principle. Place more relevant function words closer to the content words. And this is something that the brain is trying to do when it's trying to build interlanguage. It's trying to keep things together. The function word and the content word are going to try to keep them closer together because that's more meaningful and that's going to be a quicker way for them to learn. Transfer to somewhere principle. When words and ideas are similar in the first language, okay, and I want to and I'm like, oh, they're similar to the second language that I'm learning, well, then I'll try to transfer them over. When they're similar, they may not always be similar, but when they're similar, I try to transfer some of these. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Okay, and then the I don't know how to say this. Relic fixation, nope. Principle. I gotta fix this. Relixification. Yeah, relixification. Principle. I can't find the answer in the L2. I can't find the answer in the language I'm learning. I better go to the L1. I jump into the L1 and try to do something. So when I was learning Japanese and I couldn't figure out something in the Japanese, I started trying to use an English idea. Take an English idea and import it into Japanese. Okay, that's trying to use the first language as my tool because all the tools I would normally use weren't working. Right? And that's what that is. Done with those. Okay, all that we've spoken up until now are the things that are involved in the processing model, where you have the innatist ideas and the separate competence, performance, and now we're jumping into connectionism, which is more of the emergent properties of language learning. And the computer developers and their programmers who are doing research in this use something called parallel distributed processing. And basically what they're trying to do is mimic the brain processing in computers, where the brain is trying to connect things, okay, and they've got a variety of things that are trying to connect to something, connect to your eye, connect to your ear, connect to another part of the brain. There are multiple ones that are trying to connect, and the stronger one that connects is the one that's going to be the one that's used. And so that's what this parallel distributed processing is. No rules per se, just practice, and the ones that get stronger are the ones that we use. So in second language acquisition, this belief that second language learners are sensitive to patterns. Okay, we talked about this before with the other group. They're sensitive to patterns, and the patterns become stronger and stronger by repeated encounter and use. So in this case, there are no rules. Right? There are no rules and there is no learning of those rules. What there is being involved in the process and going through this process of using stock phrases to convey an idea, and you use it over and over enough, and it becomes normal. It becomes the language. Okay. You construct associations from those patterns. You're building billions of associations and extracting patterns that look like rules, but they're not. Okay? That's this whole idea of connectionism. And interestingly enough, in the world of computers, there have been some advances in research related to this. I personally don't see how this can be done without some direction. It's not just blind making connection, but there's going to be some direction going on somewhere. I don't know where I see it in the research here, but that's what I think. The impact of this idea of connectionism or parallel distributed processing is limited. The main reason is because there's not a lot of research on connectionism with second language acquisition, although there are many people who are going to think this is a good idea because they're more of the constructivist, emergent type of philosophers and theorists. But in some controlled settings, and that's what they do this work primarily in, is in a more controlled settings, there are aspects that we can see in language learning. Being involved in the process. And to be honest, when you put language learners in a social environment where they're interacting and acting within that second language, you do see some development of ability. They may not be able to articulate that ability as to why, okay, metacognitively, but they are going to gain some of that ability. The processing approaches that deal with the separate ones, there's been a lot more research in that. One reason is because it's been around much longer. The connectionism ideas have been around less. That's with that. But both of these processes help us to learn a little bit more about second language processing and hopefully to increase students' language learning capabilities. That's my goal to see here. As I look, especially in the parallel, in the processing model, I definitely see this whole idea of taking things and taking them out of short term and putting them into long term. And it may be that one way that we get something from short term into long term is to repeated exposure to it, okay, which is actually more of a connectionist idea. Ellie Hinkle, in one of her presentations at a TESOL conference, mentioned that her students, that research indicates that in order for a new vocabulary word to go from short-term memory to go into long-term memory or automatic processing, you automatically know what it is, it takes about between 6 to 12 exposures to that word in context in order to move it from short-term into long-term memory. So that takes a bit of work, okay, to push it from one to the other. But that theory now is being played out in the classroom. If I know that I need between 6 and 12, okay, I'm going to start creating activities that allow my students to take these new words and see them in context in multiple locations. And that's one way that these theories, and again, you go back and look at some of these ideas, I'm like, oh my gosh, how am I going to use this in my classroom? This is some ways that you can do that, is by looking at the processes that are there and how can I play this out in my classroom by taking things from short term or from declarative and making them procedural. That's all I have for today. If you have any questions regarding this, please let me know, and I'll talk to you later.